Hey there, I'm Golden Prestiato, and welcome to my audio class. So glad you could join me today. So here is the backdrop. The month is March. The year, 2020. Things were running relatively smoothly, and then the coronavirus pandemic moved in full force, and the world would eventually be shut down and sent into quarantine. As a result, businesses and organizations everywhere turned to the internet and live streaming as their only source of communication. Among those were churches. A small percentage of churches were already live streaming their services, but for most, they were treading on a new frontier, whether they were ready for it or not. As I've clicked into various church services online, I've noticed varying degrees in the quality of production. Some are quite good, but many are quite difficult to listen to. But really quick, let's put ourselves in the position of the online viewer who has just run across your church's service for the first time. Their first impression of your church will be based on what they see and hear. This is why it is so important that we learn how to create a broadcast stream that will keep your viewers' attention. To make this happen, we need to ask ourselves, what is the main production goal that we are trying to accomplish with our live stream? And here it is, folks. The main production goal of your live stream broadcast mix is to recreate the live worship experience as much as possible for the online listener. I've been a front of house and broadcast mixer for quite a while now. First for Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa, where my broadcast mix ended up not only online, but also on K-Wave radio. And then for St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Newport Beach, California. And I've had quite a few freelance opportunities as well. So needless to say, I've learned quite a bit, some through education and a lot through trial and error. Now, I imagine there are a number of you who are in this trial and error stage with your service live streams and just wish someone would tell you how to get the job done. Well, this class is for you, and I'm super happy to pass on my experiences to you. So, how many of you have observed this while watching a live church stream? You can see the drummer, you can see the bass player, and you can see the electric guitar player all playing their instruments, but you can't hear them in the live stream. You may be seeing all these people worshiping, but only hearing the worship leader, a guitar, and perhaps a few vocals. And with that thought, let's dive on into some best practices in broadcast mixing. Number one, when it comes to capturing everything in your broadcast mix, this is the rule of thumb. If you want it to be heard, it needs to be mic'd or plugged in. Yes, that's right, folks. Mic each drum, mic your electric guitar amps, anything that can be plugged in through a direct box, like acoustic guitars and keyboards, etc. Mic your acoustic piano, mic your percussion, if you have it. And microphones, you guys, microphones are like the ears of your broadcast mix. Just because something is loud in the house to your ears doesn't mean that the broadcast mix can hear it. One thing you may not have considered is setting up some audience mics in the room, preferably facing away from the main speakers. The audience involvement in worship and reactions to the pastor's teaching are absolutely necessary in recreating the live worship experience for the online listener. So watch this video clip of call and response and note the audience mics capturing the audience participation.
Please join me in the responsive reading. Brothers and sisters, what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. In love, God predestined us for adoption through Christ Jesus, to the praise of his glorious grace. Therefore you are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. Since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another.
so you can see how important audience mics are for your broadcast mix. Okay, so now on to number 2. Create a dedicated broadcast mix for your live stream. Do not send your house mix to your live stream. Your main mix should be dedicated to the house only. Remember, when you're mixing the house, you're accounting for acoustic noise in the room. So you may not choose to reinforce every instrument at the same volume, which, if you were sending the main mix to your live stream, would result in a very unbalanced sounding mix for the online listener. So super important, create a dedicated broadcast mix for your live stream. And here's how we'll set that up. I'll be demonstrating on a QSC TouchMix 30 Pro mixer, but the concepts I'll show you can be applied on most consoles. Your dedicated broadcast mix should be set up in stereo, even if you're running your house system in mono. So step 1, choose 2 output channels. On my TouchMix, my outputs are referred to as auxes. On other consoles, they may be referred to as buses. Whether your outputs are referred to as auxes or buses, they're going to perform the same function. Step 2, link your aux or bus outputs to create a stereo mix. I'm going to link auxes 7 and 8. Many consoles only allow you to link starting on an odd number. This is why I'm starting on aux 7. So, on my mixer, I will choose aux 7. Then click in the gray area above the master fader of aux 7. This brings up my output channel parameters. Then I will choose Setup. Right here is the Link button. It asks me to confirm that I want to link channels, and voila! I know my channels are linked because aux 7 and 8 have been combined into one box over here on the left. And another indication that they are linked is that the master faders for aux 7 and 8 now move together. This will be the case on most digital consoles. Now we need to hook up our dedicated stereo mix to whatever video capture device is being used. That could be a smart device via an audio interface, a video camera, or a video switcher. So step 3, take the broadcast outputs from your mixer, in this case 7 and 8, and plug them into your video capture device. 7 would be plugged into the left channel of your video, and 8 will be plugged into the right channel of your video. Okay, so now on to number 3 of our best practices for broadcast mixing. Make use of your stereo field. We are going to pan instruments to the left and to the right of our stereo field. This helps create delineation between instruments, resulting in a wider, fuller sounding mix. Generally, when applying panning for a broadcast mix, you'll want to place instruments in your sonic landscape according to where the musicians are positioned on stage. I remember mixing broadcasts for my church several years ago, and the tech director came in, looked at my TV monitor, listened to my mix, and said, "Why is your electric guitar mixed to the right and he's standing on the left? Fix it!" So I fixed it. Okay, so let's take a look at our TouchMix 30 and set the panning for the instruments in our mix. Kick and snare will remain mixed up the center. Hi-hat will be panned 70 to 80% to the right because that's where it is located on the drum kit. Your first rack tom might be panned 50% to the right, middle tom up the center, and your floor tom 60 to 70% to the left. Your overhead should be panned about 80 to 90% left and right. Keyboards are generally panned hard left-right if they are playing ambient pads or rhythm parts. If you have a second keyboard, you could pan it 50% to the left and right. If a keyboard is generally playing lead lines, you might consider panning it according to their position on stage. Acoustic guitar, which is in many cases what the worship leader might be playing, can be mixed slightly to either the left or the right, depending on where your other instruments are in the stereo field. If you have 2 acoustic guitars, Try panning them slightly opposite of each other. Electric guitars will normally be panned according to where they're standing. If there are two electric guitars on stage, pan them opposite each other to create delineation between the two. Components of your mix that will generally be mixed up the center would be bass guitar, vocals, and worship tracks if you're using those. All spoken word should remain mixed up the center as well. And number 4 in our best practices for broadcast mixing, pay close attention to the amount of effects in your broadcast mix during the worship time. When used in the proper amount, one thing effects will do for the musical portion of your broadcast mix is to help the feeling of being in the room with the audience. If you've listened to your mics in the broadcast mix without effects, you'll find they're very, very dry and in your face. Since our goal is to recreate the live worship experience, that means recreating the room sound as well. As you're listening to your mix, use your ear when adjusting the effects masters for your broadcast. You don't want your band to feel like it's swimming in effects, but you do want the feeling of space, and effects like reverb and/or delay will do that for you. So, some of you are probably wondering, well, you talked about audience mics, why can't I just use those to recreate the room sound? Good thinking, and yes, you can totally do that. Some amount of audience mics definitely helps with that. But here's some things to watch out for. If you use too much of your audience mics, you'll hear your mix start to hollow out and lose clarity. The best way to use those audience mics is to ride them throughout the worship time. When the band is playing, you can set them low enough so that your mix doesn't sound hollow. But when there are a cappella sections, push them out so you can really hear the audience voices. Push those audience mics out at those times when the audience is responding or clapping, whatever the case may be. Now, during the teaching, I usually keep audience mics at an amount where you can hear audience response, but not so much level that the speaker loses clarity. Okay, so on to number 5 in our best practices for broadcast mixing. Monitor your broadcast meters so that they're hitting near the same level throughout your service. During our time in quarantine in March and April of 2020, our family would all pile into bed together. We have 4 kids, and we were watching our services online. When the worship music was streaming, we had our TV at a good volume. But the minute someone would get up and talk, the volume was very low, and consequently, throughout the service, we had to keep turning the TV volume up and down and up and down in order to participate. Have any of you ever experienced that before? It becomes tiresome after a while. When our family is sitting inside our church's meeting space, it's expected that the dynamics of the worship music will often be louder than the spoken word. However, for those participating online, it's expected that the level will remain somewhat constant between the music and the spoken word. And here's the truth of the matter. The online listener should never have to adjust their volume. It's the job of the person running the broadcast mix to monitor the broadcast meters and make the proper adjustments during the service so that those meters are hitting at about the same level. Here's a few tips to help you manage your broadcast meters. First, the output meter of your broadcast mix needs to be in front of you at all times. Whether that means customizing your fader banks on your console to include the broadcast meter or using an iPad or tablet to display it in front of you, that meter and access to the broadcast master fader needs to be in your line of sight always. Second, you'll notice that you need to push the level on the spoken word in your broadcast mix quite a bit in order to keep your broadcast master meter near the same level as your worship music. Third, don't overcompress your master broadcast signal as a means of controlling levels. Overcompressing a signal really affects the quality of the audio in an adverse way. It's a good idea to use a limiter on your broadcast signal, but only to help prevent clipping of the audio signal going into your video. For example, if there's a sudden level change and somebody, say, drops a mic, God forbid that would happen, the limiter will catch it and keep the audio from clipping in the video. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at 3 different ways you can set up your broadcast mix. Option 1, running your broadcast mix in post fader. If you're one person managing front of house and the broadcast mix at the same time, then this option is best for you. On my touch mix, if I access the setup menu for my broadcast mix, there are 4 choices in the middle of the screen: pre-fader, post-fader, pre-dynamics, and pre-all. Whichever console you're working on, choose post-fader. Post-fader means that anytime you make a change to a channel fader in your main mix, that channel in your dedicated broadcast mix will reflect the change as well. For example, in the main mix of my praise band scene, right here, if I move this guitar fader up in the main mix, the volume will go up in the broadcast mix as well. If I move the vocal up or down in the main mix, that move will be reflected in the broadcast mix as well. Now, you'll need to have your broadcast mix cued and ready to listen to in your headphones. You will find yourself constantly referring to your broadcast mix through your headphones to make sure that that mix stays intact throughout the service. Just keep those headphones around your neck and ready to go. On my touch mix, this is how I cue my broadcast mix. I select my broadcast output, and then above my master fader, select Cue. Make sure your broadcast mix is cued on whichever mixer you're using. This next part is important. Before you start working with your broadcast mix, you'll want to set your house mix. Why? Well, your post-fader broadcast mix is going to be set based on what your house mix is. Okay. When you're running your broadcast mix in post-fader like this, you'll need to implement something I call broadcast compensation. Broadcast compensation is compensating in your broadcast mix for the lack of level that is being sent to you from your main mix. Let's look at my Touch Mix 30 for an example. Take this snare drum. My main fader level is quite low because that snare is already putting enough volume acoustically in the house so that this was all the level I needed to make it properly sit in the house mix. But when I listen in my headphones to my broadcast mix, I can hardly hear any snare at all. So I need to compensate for the lack of level by bringing the snare up in my broadcast mix until it's sitting properly in that mix. You may find yourself applying broadcast compensation to most instruments that use loud amps, like electric guitars, bass, or even keys if they're using amps. Now, there are certain room situations where you can't reinforce the drums at all. And here's the solution for that. We are going to unassign drums from the house mix. This means that we will not reinforce drums at all in the house. This way, we can leave the main faders for drums up in the main mix in order to feed level to our broadcast mix. Because remember, we're running our broadcast mix in post fader, so we need to have channel faders up in the main mix. On my Touch Mix 30 Pro, here's how I unassign channels from my main mix. You can do the same on whichever console you're working with. I'll unassign my snare drum, for example. Select the gray space where my snare channel is, then select Setup. This is where I can unassign that channel from the house. Oh, and FYI, your audience mic's channels must always be unassigned from the main mix. All right, let's look at option 2 for setting up a broadcast mix. Running your broadcast mix in pre-fader. This option is perfect if you have an additional person dedicated to mixing broadcast. Pre-fader means any changes you make to the main faders will not affect the broadcast mix. Because of this, you will not have to compensate for anything going on in the main mix. The volume levels in your broadcast mix are running totally free from your main mix. On my touch mix, if I access the setup menu for my broadcast mix, remember those 4 choices I showed you earlier in the middle of the screen? Choose pre-fader. Whichever console you're working on, you'll want to do the same. In the pre-fader broadcast scenario, the person mixing can be in an isolated space with studio monitors to reference the service. This gives a truer sense of what the online listener is experiencing. The person mixing is now able to make some fine adjustments to the levels in the mix, since they are now free from hearing bleed from the main service meeting space. By connecting via Wi-Fi multiple tablets or iPads to your front of house console, you can create a whole virtual broadcast console, as seen in this picture. This is Brendan from Calvary Fellowship in St. Petersburg, Florida, mixing in pre-fader using iPads and studio monitors. Okay, let's look at option 3 for setting up a broadcast mix. Running your broadcast mix from a DAW, or digital audio workstation, on a computer, like GarageBand or Logic, Pro Tools, or Reaper. There's a bunch of them out there. This is fast becoming a popular way to produce a broadcast mix. Unlike mixing broadcast from the same mixer as front of house, where channel EQs and dynamics are shared between the main mix and the broadcast mix, mixing from a DAW gives you complete control over every aspect of the broadcast. It's the equivalent of having a completely dedicated console just for your broadcast mix. However, with such great flexibility and control comes complexity. Not everyone has the chops to create their own great sounding session in their DAW. So there are companies out there that have created some really excellent DAW templates for church use in broadcast mixing. One such company is called worshiptech.live. They've created some wonderful worship templates for Ableton, Audition, Cubase, GarageBand, Logic, Pro Tools, Reaper, and Studio One. I'm going to use their Logic template to demonstrate interfacing my mixer to my DAW. Here is what the worshiptech.live Logic broadcast template looks like. The beautiful thing about these templates is much of what I've already talked about as far as best practices for broadcast mixing are already built into the template. All we have to do is connect our mixer channels to the DAW channels. Most consumer digital consoles will hook up to the DAW via a simple USB connection like the one on the back of my TouchMix 30 right here. Pro-level consoles will use an audio network protocol like Dante. Either way, the concept of assigning the audio from the channels on your mixer to the channels in the DAW are similar. And now, let's set up my DAW, which is Logic in this case. Make sure the output and input devices are the mixer that you're using, or Dante if you're using that. In my case, it says QSC TM30 Pro, and that's correct. FYI, your Mac is Core Audio compatible. This means it will automatically see your audio interface when plugged in. If you're using a PC, you will need to download and install the ASIO driver first. Now let's assign our mixer channels to the DAW. Channel 1 in our DAW is the kick drum. Channel 1 is also the kick drum in my mixer. Right here, where it says Input, is where I assign my mixer channels. And I can see here that it is indeed assigned to Channel 1. Channel 2 is my snare top on both the DAW and the mixer, so that's correct. Channel 3 on my DAW is the snare bottom, a bottom mic for the snare. Now, I don't have a snare bottom mic on my mixer session, so I'm just going to choose no input on this channel. Any DAW channels that you are not using on this template, you'll want to make sure that you assign those as no input. Let's jump over to DAW channels 15 and 16, which are my stereo keyboard channels. On my mixer, those are actually channels 11 and 12, so I will assign those to 11 and 12 in my DAW. So you get the idea on how to assign the channels from your mixer to your DAW template. Now you get to use those mixing ears and put all those faders in the right place for a sweet sounding broadcast mix. Quick note, the DAW broadcast option is definitely best if you have a dedicated person to run the DAW mix. So, in closing, are there other ways to set up a broadcast mix? Absolutely, and you may want to explore those other options. To finish off this session, I have a few examples of broadcast mixes that I have done. The first clip is from a contemporary service, and the second is from a classical service at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Newport Beach, California. It's been a pleasure sharing with you today. Now, go outside your church walls and reach the world with your stellar sounding broadcast stream. I'm Golden Preciado. Thank you for watching.